Marina pulled her scarf tighter as the morning breeze swept across the cobblestone streets of Prague. She had been working as a tour guide for 3 years now, and she knew every crack in these ancient stones, every story behind the colorful buildings that lined the narrow streets. But today felt different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. She was running late for her first tour of the day when she heard someone calling out in broken Czech behind her. "Excuse me, miss. Please help." Marina turned around to see a tall man with sandy brown hair, looking completely lost. He was wearing a faded blue backpack that had seen better days, sneakers that were practical but worn, and a confused expression that immediately made her smile. American tourists, she thought to herself. They always had that slightly overwhelmed look when they first arrived in Prague. "Are you okay?" she asked in English, noting the relief that washed over his face when he heard his native language. "Oh, thank God you speak English," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I've been walking in circles for the past hour trying to find Charles Bridge. I thought I was following the map correctly, but somehow I ended up here instead." He gestured around at the quiet residential street they were standing on, which was definitely not anywhere near the famous bridge. Marina couldn't help but laugh. "You're about 15 minutes in the wrong direction," she said. "How did you manage that?" The man looked sheepish. "I may have held the map upside down for the first part of my walk," he admitted. "I'm David, by the way, and I'm clearly not very good at navigating foreign cities." "I'm Marina," she replied, checking her watch. She had a group tour starting in 20 minutes, but something about this lost American made her want to help him. "Listen, I'm actually a tour guide here in Prague. I have a group tour starting soon, but I can point you in the right direction to the bridge." David's eyes lit up. "You're a tour guide? That's perfect. Are you taking new people for your tour today?" Marina shook her head. "Sorry, this one's already fully booked. But I can give you directions to Charles Bridge, and there are other guides who work the area if you want a tour." "Actually," David said, shifting his backpack to his other shoulder, "I was hoping to find someone who could show me the real Prague. Not just the tourist spots that everyone goes to. I've got a whole week here and I want to see what the city is actually like." There was something genuine in his voice that caught Marina's attention. Most tourists wanted to check off the famous landmarks and take photos, but David seemed different. He looked around the quiet street they were standing on with real curiosity, like he was trying to understand the place rather than just see it. "What do you mean by the real Prague?" Marina asked. David thought for a moment. "Well, like this street we're on right now. I bet there are stories here. History that most people never hear about. I want to understand how people actually live here, what the culture is really like. The guidebooks can tell me about the castle and the astronomical clock, but they can't tell me what it's like to grow up here, or what the best local restaurant is, or why that building over there has such interesting architecture." Marina found herself impressed. In 3 years of guiding tourists, she rarely heard someone express that kind of genuine interest in local culture. Most people wanted the quick overview and some good photos for social media. "That's refreshing to hear," she said, "but I have to warn you, my private tours aren't cheap. And if you want to see the real Prague, we'd need several days to do it properly." "Money's not an issue," David said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, I saved up for this trip. It's important to me to experience it, right?" Marina studied his face. He seemed sincere, and she did have some openings in her schedule for private tours. Plus, she had to admit, there was something appealing about showing someone who seemed to actually care about what she had to share. "Tell you what," she said, "I'll make you a deal. I'll show you to Charles Bridge now so you can get oriented, and if you're serious about wanting the real Prague experience, we can talk about setting up some private tours for the rest of your week." "That sounds perfect," David said, his whole face brightening. "Lead the way." As they walked through the winding streets toward the river, Marina found herself enjoying David's company. He asked thoughtful questions about the buildings they passed, seemed genuinely interested in the history she shared, and had a self-deprecating sense of humor about his navigation skills. "So what brought you to Prague?" Marina asked as they walked. "I needed to get away from everything back home for a while," David said, which struck Marina as an interesting way to put it. "I've been working too much, dealing with too much pressure from family about my future. I wanted to go somewhere beautiful where I could think clearly and just be myself for a few days. And you chose Prague?" "I've always been drawn to places with deep history," David explained. There's something about walking through streets that have existed for centuries that puts your own problems in perspective, you know? Marina nodded. She had felt that same way when she first moved to Prague from her small hometown. The city had a way of making you feel connected to something larger than yourself. When they reached Charles Bridge, Marina watched David's reaction. Instead of immediately pulling out his phone to take photos like most tourists did, he stood quietly for a moment, taking in the view of the castle across the river and the statues lining the ancient bridge. "It's incredible," he said finally. "How old is it?" "The foundation stone was laid in 1357, Marina replied, though most people don't know that the timing was very specific. They started construction at exactly 5:31 a.m. on July 9th, because the royal mathematicians believed that the palindromic number sequence 135797531 would give the bridge magical properties to make it strong. David turned to look at her with genuine surprise. "Seriously? That's amazing. You don't learn details like that from guidebooks." "That's what I mean about the real Prague," Marina said with a smile. "There are stories like that everywhere if you know where to look." They spent another few minutes on the bridge, with Marina pointing out details in the statues and explaining some of the legends associated with them. David listened intently, asking follow-up questions that showed he was really processing what she was telling him. "So," Marina said as they prepared to part ways, "are you serious about those private tours?" "Absolutely," David said without hesitation. "When can we start?" Marina pulled out her phone to check her schedule. "I could do tomorrow afternoon if you want. 3 hours and I'll show you some neighborhoods most tourists never see." "Perfect. How much?" Marina quoted her usual rate for private tours, expecting David to negotiate or ask for a discount like many tourists did. Instead, he just nodded and pulled out a well-worn wallet. "Cash okay?" he asked, counting out bills. "I prefer to pay as we go." "That's fine," Marina said, though she was a bit surprised. Most people paid by card these days, especially tourists, but David seemed to prefer doing things the old-fashioned way. As she watched him carefully fold the remaining bills back into his wallet, Marina noticed something that struck her as slightly odd. For someone who was clearly budget-conscious enough to stay in hostels and wear worn sneakers, David's wallet looked expensive, but she dismissed the thought quickly. Maybe it was a gift from family before his trip. "I'll meet you at the astronomical clock tomorrow at 2 p.m., Marina said, "and dress comfortably. We'll be doing a lot of walking." "Looking forward to it," David said with a genuine smile. "And Marina, thanks for helping a lost tourist today. Not everyone would have taken the time." As Marina watched David walk away, disappearing into the crowd of tourists on Charles Bridge, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow's tour more than she had anticipated. There was something different about him, something that made her think this week might be more interesting than usual. The next afternoon, Marina arrived at the astronomical clock 5 minutes early, which was unusual for her. She told herself it was just professional punctuality, but deep down she knew she was looking forward to spending more time with David. She spotted him waiting near the clock, and he waved when he saw her approaching. "Right on time," she said with a smile. "Ready to see some parts of Prague that aren't in any guidebook?" "I've been looking forward to this all morning," David replied, and Marina could tell he meant it. "Where are we starting?" "Follow me," Marina said, leading him away from the crowded old town square. "We're going to Vinohrady first. It's a neighborhood where real Prague people live, work, and play." As they walked through the quieter streets, Marina found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with clients. David asked thoughtful questions about everything they passed. When they walked by a small playground where children were playing, he wanted to know about the education system in Czech Republic. When they passed an elderly man feeding pigeons, David asked about retirement and how older people spent their time in Prague. "You're really curious about daily life here," Marina observed as they stopped at a local cafe that definitely wasn't in any tourist guide. "I guess I am," David said, looking a bit embarrassed. "Back home, everyone's always rushing around, focused on work and success. It seems like people here have a different relationship with life, like they actually enjoy the simple moments." Marina ordered them coffee and traditional Czech pastries from the elderly woman behind the counter, who clearly knew her well. As they sat at a small table by the window, David seemed completely comfortable in the humble surroundings, but Marina noticed something that made her pause. When he reached for his coffee cup, she caught sight of his watch. It was simple and understated, But Marina had seen enough luxury watches on wealthy tourists to recognize quality when she saw it. This wasn't the kind of watch someone wearing worn sneakers and staying in hostels would typically own. "That's a nice watch," she said casually. David glanced down at his wrist and seemed momentarily uncomfortable. "Oh, this old thing? It was a gift from my grandfather before he passed away. Sentimental value, you know." The explanation made perfect sense, and Marina felt silly for even noticing. Of course it could be a family heirloom. She pushed the thought aside. "Tell me about your family," Marina said, genuinely curious. David was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee slowly. "It's complicated," he said finally. "My father has very specific ideas about what my life should look like. He wants me to follow in his footsteps, take over the family business, marry the right kind of woman. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating under all those expectations." "What kind of business?" Marina asked. "Oh, just a small company," David said vaguely. "Nothing too exciting." "What about you? Do you have family here in Prague?" Marina noticed how quickly he changed the subject, but she didn't push. Everyone had family drama, and maybe his was particularly painful to talk about. "My parents live in a small town about 2 hours from here," Marina explained. "They think I'm crazy for trying to make a living as a tour guide instead of getting a real job in an office somewhere." "But you love what you do," David observed. "I can tell when you talk about Prague's history. Your whole face lights up." Marina felt a warm flutter in her chest at his words. "I do love it, but sometimes I wonder if I'm being realistic. I have this dream of opening my own cultural center someday. A place where locals and visitors could come together to really understand Czech culture. Not just tours, but classes, events, real community connection." "That sounds incredible," David said, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Tell me more about this idea." For the next hour, Marina found herself sharing details about her dream that she had never told anyone. David listened intently, asking smart questions about logistics, funding, and programming that surprised her with their depth. "You've really thought this through," he said when she finished explaining her vision. "Have you looked into grant opportunities or investors?" Marina laughed. "Investors? For a small cultural center in Prague? I think you're overestimating how exciting my little dream is to people with money." Something flickered across David's face, but it was gone so quickly Marina wasn't sure she had seen it. "You never know," he said simply. "Good ideas have a way of finding support." They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through Vinohrady and then into the Karlín district. David insisted on taking the metro and walking everywhere, even when Marina suggested they could take a taxi to save time. He seemed fascinated by public transportation, studying the metro map like it contained secrets of the universe. At dinner, they found a tiny restaurant that Marina had discovered years ago. The owner, Pavel, greeted Marina like family and insisted on bringing them extra courses to try. David charmed Pavel with his attempts at Czech phrases, even though his pronunciation was terrible. "You have good taste in restaurants," David said as they shared a traditional goulash. "This is incredible. Pavel's been cooking here for 30 years, Marina explained. His grandmother taught him all these recipes. You won't find food like this in any fancy hotel restaurant. I wouldn't want to eat at fancy hotel restaurants anyway," David said. "This is so much better." When it came time to pay, David insisted on covering the bill. Marina watched as he left what seemed like an unusually generous tip, but Pavel's grateful smile made her think maybe she was imagining things. David was probably just trying to make up for his terrible Czech pronunciation. As they walked back toward the city center, the evening air was cool and comfortable. Marina found herself walking closer to David than she normally would with a client, and she noticed he had excellent posture and moved with a confidence that seemed at odds with his humble traveler persona. "Can I ask you something?" Marina said as they paused on a bridge overlooking the river. "Of course," David replied, though something in his tone suggested he was suddenly nervous. "You seem really comfortable here, like you're used to traveling and being in new places, but you also seem genuinely surprised by everything, like it's all new to you. It's an interesting combination." David was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the water. "I guess I've done some traveling for work," he said carefully. "But this is different. This is the first time I've traveled just for myself, just to experience a place without any agenda or pressure." Marina could hear the sincerity in his voice. and it made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. There was something vulnerable about David, something that made her want to protect whatever peace he was finding here in Prague. "Well, I'm glad you chose Prague for your personal adventure," she said softly. David turned to look at her, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with possibility. "So am I," he said, his voice equally soft. They stood there for another minute, both looking out over the water, both aware of the growing connection between them, but neither quite ready to acknowledge it out loud. "Same time tomorrow?" David asked as they prepared to part ways. "Actually," Marina said, making a decision that surprised her, "tomorrow's Saturday. I don't usually work weekends, but if you want, I could show you the Saturday farmers market. It's where all the locals go for fresh food and flowers." David's smile was answer enough. "I would love that," he said. "Thank you, Marina, for today, for sharing your city with me. It means more than you know." As Marina walked home that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about the way David had said her name, or the genuine gratitude in his voice. She also couldn't stop thinking about the small inconsistencies she had noticed throughout the day. But every time doubt crept into her mind, she remembered the vulnerability in his eyes when he talked about his family's expectations, or the way he had listened so intently to her dreams. Whatever David's story was, Marina was beginning to realize she wanted to be part of it. Saturday morning at the farmer's market started perfectly. Marina met David near the entrance, and his face lit up when he saw the colorful stalls filled with fresh vegetables, homemade breads, and local crafts. He seemed genuinely excited to experience this slice of Prague life that most tourists never saw. "This is exactly what I was hoping to find," David said as they walked between the stalls. "Real people living real lives." Marina introduced him to several vendors she knew well. David tried his broken Czech with each one, making them laugh with his pronunciation but charming them with his genuine effort. When they stopped at Marina's favorite flower stall, David insisted on buying her a small bouquet of sunflowers. "You don't have to do that," Marina protested. But David was already handing money to the elderly vendor. "I want to," he said simply. "Besides, you've been so generous with your time, showing me parts of your city that most people never get to see." They were sampling homemade cheese at another stall when David's phone rang. Marina watched as his expression changed the moment he looked at the screen. The relaxed, happy man she had been walking with suddenly looked tense and serious. "I'm sorry, I have to take this," he said, stepping away from the stall. "It'll just be a minute." Marina tried not to listen, but she couldn't help overhearing part of the conversation. David was speaking in what sounded like perfect German, his voice low and urgent. She caught a few words that sounded like business terms, but her German wasn't good enough to understand the full conversation. When he returned, David looked apologetic, but also distracted. "Sorry about that. Family business back home." "Your German is really good," Marina observed, trying to keep her tone casual. David seemed surprised that she had noticed. "Oh, I took some classes in college. You know how it is, you learn a language and then you have to use it occasionally or you lose it." The explanation made sense, but something about his tone suggested there was more to it. Marina had heard enough tourists attempt foreign languages to recognize the difference between someone who had studied a language in school and someone who was truly fluent. David had sounded completely comfortable speaking German. They continued walking through the market, but David seemed distracted now. His phone buzzed several more times, and each time he glanced at it with that same serious expression before putting it away without responding. "Everything okay?" Marina asked after the fourth buzz. "Just work stuff," David said, but his smile looked forced. "Nothing that can't wait until I get back home." When they stopped for lunch at a small cafe near the market, David excused himself to make another phone call. This time Marina couldn't help but notice he was speaking French. Not the halting, textbook French of a language student, but rapid, confident French with what sounded like business terminology scattered through. "Out." Marina felt a strange knot forming in her stomach. Who was this man, really? In college, she had studied both German and French, and she knew the difference between academic language learning and true fluency. David wasn't just someone who had taken a few language classes. He was clearly comfortable conducting serious conversations in multiple languages. When David returned to the table, Marina decided to test her suspicions. "You mentioned your family has a small business," she said carefully. "What kind of company is it?" David took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "It's in imports and exports," he said vaguely. Nothing too exciting, just moving goods from one place to another. That must require a lot of international communication, Marina observed. I guess that explains why you speak German and French so well. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You heard my phone calls? I couldn't help but notice, Marina said. You sound completely fluent in both languages. That's pretty impressive for someone in a small family business. For a moment, David looked like he wanted to say something more, but then he just shrugged. We deal with suppliers all over Europe. You pick up languages when you have to use them regularly. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Marina couldn't shake the feeling that David was being deliberately vague about his background. Every answer he gave raised more questions in her mind. That afternoon, they visited Prague Castle together. As they walked through the ancient courtyards, David's knowledge of European history impressed Marina. He didn't just ask questions about Czech history. He made connections to political events in other countries, demonstrated understanding of complex economic systems, and showed familiarity with international business practices that seemed far beyond what someone from a small import-export company would need to know. You really know a lot about European politics, Marina commented as they stood looking out over the city from the castle grounds. I read a lot, David said, but again his answer felt incomplete. They were heading back toward the city center when Marina's friend Katka called. Marina, you have to meet me for coffee right now, Katka said urgently. I have something incredible to tell you about your American tourist. What are you talking about? Marina asked, glancing at David, who was looking at his phone again. Just meet me at Café Louvre in 20 minutes, Katka insisted. And bring him if you want, but this is something you need to hear. Marina was puzzled. But she agreed to meet Katka. When she told David about the change in plans, he looked almost relieved. Actually, I should probably go back to my hostel and rest for a bit, he said. All this walking is catching up with me. But thank you for today. The market was exactly what I was hoping to experience. They parted ways near the castle, and Marina headed to meet Katka, her mind spinning with questions about David's mysterious phone calls and his surprising knowledge of languages and international affairs. Katka was already waiting at a corner table when Marina arrived, practically bouncing with excitement. Okay, tell me about this American guy you've been showing around, Katka demanded before Marina had even sat down. What's this about? Marina asked, ordering coffee from the passing waiter. I work at that international business magazine, right? Katka said. Well, yesterday I was going through some old issues for a research project and I swear I saw your tourist's photo. Marina felt her heart skip a beat. That's impossible. David's just a regular guy from America taking a vacation. David what? Katka asked sharply. David, I don't actually know his last name. Marina realized. But Katka, you're being crazy. There are millions of Americans. It's just a coincidence. Maybe, Katka said, but she didn't look convinced. But Marina, I also saw him this morning getting out of a black Mercedes near the Four Seasons Hotel. Not exactly budget traveler transportation. Marina's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Are you sure it was him? Tall, sandy brown hair, really good looking. Yeah, I'm sure. And Marina, the Mercedes had diplomatic plates. The pieces of information swirled in Marina's head. The expensive watch. The perfect German and French. The sophisticated knowledge of business and politics. The mysterious phone calls. And now Katka claiming she had seen him with luxury transportation and possibly in a business magazine. There has to be an explanation, Marina said, but her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. Marina, Katka said gently, what if this guy isn't who he says he is? What if he's not just some regular tourist? Marina thought about the past 3 days she had spent with David. The genuine curiosity about local culture, the vulnerability when he talked about his family, the way he listened when she shared her dreams, even if he was hiding something about his background. The connection she felt with him seemed real. Even if he's not telling me everything about himself, Marina said slowly, I don't think he's trying to hurt anyone. Maybe he has his reasons for wanting privacy. Katka reached across the table and squeezed Marina's hand. Just be careful, okay? I care about you, and I don't want to see you get hurt by someone who might be playing games. As Marina walked home that evening, her mind was full of conflicting thoughts. Part of her wanted to confront David directly and ask him to tell her the truth about who he really was. But another part of her was afraid of what she might learn. What if the man she was beginning to fall for was completely different from who she thought he was? She pulled out her phone to text David, then put it away without sending anything. Tomorrow was his last full day in Prague. Maybe she should just enjoy whatever time they had left together and not worry about mysteries that might destroy something beautiful before it had a chance to fully bloom. But deep down, Marina knew she couldn't ignore the questions much longer. The David she had been spending time with felt real and genuine, but the evidence was mounting that he was hiding something significant about his true identity. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out what it was. Sunday morning came too quickly for Marina. She woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest, knowing this was David's last full day in Prague. Despite all the questions swirling in her mind about his mysterious phone calls and Katka's suspicions, Marina couldn't deny that she had grown attached to him. Over the past week, they had planned to spend the day visiting some of Prague's quieter museums and taking a final walk through the neighborhoods they had explored together. When Marina met David at their usual spot near the astronomical clock, she immediately noticed something different about him. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well, and there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay?" Marina asked as they started walking toward their first destination. "Just thinking about going back home tomorrow," David said, but his voice carried a weight that suggested he was thinking about much more than just the end of a vacation. They visited the Museum of Czech Music first, where David seemed distracted despite his usual polite interest in everything Marina showed him. His phone buzzed constantly throughout the morning, and each time he glanced at it, his expression grew more troubled. "You seem stressed today," Marina observed as they sat on a bench in Petrin Park, looking out over the city. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Marina, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If someone you cared about wasn't completely honest with you about their background but their feelings for you were genuine, how would you feel about that?" Marina's heart started beating faster. This felt like the conversation she had been both dreading and hoping for. "I guess it would depend on why they weren't being honest," she said carefully. "And how big the lie was. What if they had good reasons for keeping things private, but they realized they were in too deep to come clean without destroying everything?" Marina turned to look at David directly. "Are we talking about a hypothetical situation, or are you trying to tell me something?" David met her eyes for a moment, and Marina saw something that looked like pain there. "I guess I'm just thinking about complicated situations," he said, looking away again. The rest of the day continued with this strange tension hanging between them. David seemed like he wanted to say something important, but couldn't bring himself to do it. When they stopped for lunch at a small restaurant, he barely touched his food. Marina found herself studying his face, noticing details she had missed before: the way he carried himself, the expensive watch he wore so casually, the confidence that seemed to come naturally to him despite his claims of being just a regular guy from a small town. In the afternoon, they walked through the Jewish quarter, and David's knowledge of European history once again impressed Marina. But now, instead of just appreciating his intelligence, she found herself wondering where exactly he had learned so much about international politics and business. "David," Marina said as they stood outside the old Jewish cemetery, "can I ask you something honestly?" He looked nervous but nodded. "What do you really do for work back home?" David was quiet for so long that Marina thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "It's complicated, Marina. My family's business is bigger than I made it sound." "How much bigger?" "A lot bigger," David admitted. "But Marina, I need you to understand something. Everything I've told you about wanting to escape family pressure, about needing to be somewhere I'll just be myself, all of that is true. The only thing I haven't been honest about is the scale of the business world I come from." Marina felt a mix of relief and confusion. So there was more to David's story, but he wasn't denying it anymore. "Why didn't you just tell me from the beginning?" "Because I wanted to meet someone who could like me for who I am, not for what my family has built," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Before Marina could respond, David's phone rang again. This time, instead of stepping away, he declined the call immediately. But Marina had seen the name on the screen. Morrison Industries, board meeting. Morrison Industries. Marina knew that name. It was one of the biggest international corporations in the world, with headquarters in New York and offices across Europe. She had seen their name in newspapers and business magazines countless times. Morrison Industries, Marina said, and she watched David's face go pale. Marina, I can explain. That's your family's small import-export business? Marina's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. David looked like he wanted to disappear. I was going to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Morrison Industries isn't a small business, David. It's a massive corporation. I've seen their name in news articles about international trade deals. I know how this looks, David said desperately. But please let me explain. Yes, my family owns Morrison Industries. My father is the CEO, and yes, someday I'm expected to take over. But Marina, that's exactly why I needed to get away. That's exactly why I've been traveling like a regular person, staying in hostels, taking public transportation. I wanted to experience life the way normal people do. Marina felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. So when you said you were dealing with family pressure about your future, I meant pressure to come back and start taking on more responsibility in a multi-billion-dollar company. David finished. Pressure to marry someone from another wealthy family to strengthen business connections. Pressure to give up any hope of having a normal life or relationships. They stood there in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just been revealed. Marina's mind was racing. David Morrison. She was almost certain she had heard that name before. Probably in some business article Katka had shown her. I need some time to think about this, Marina said finally. Of course, David said, and Marina could hear the defeat in his voice. I understand if you don't want to see me again before I leave tomorrow. I didn't say that, Marina replied, but her voice sounded uncertain even to her. This is a lot to process. They walked back toward the city center in uncomfortable silence. When they reached the point where they usually parted ways, David seemed like he wanted to say something more, but Marina spoke first. I'll call you tonight, she said. After I've had some time to think. David nodded, looking miserable. Marina, for what it's worth, every moment I've spent with you this week has been the most real and honest I've felt in years. The business stuff, the money, the family name, none of that was the real me. The person you've been spending time with, that's who I really am underneath all the rest of it. As Marina walked home, her phone rang. It was Katka. Marina, you need to sit down, Katka said without any greeting. I found the magazine article I was thinking of. Katka, I don't need to see it. David already told me he's not who he claimed to be. Marina, I'm looking at a photo of David Morrison, heir to Morrison Industries, listed as one of America's youngest billionaires. The article is from 6 months ago and it says he's worth over $2 billion personally. Marina stopped walking. Billion? With a B? With a very big B, Katka confirmed. Marina, this isn't just about him having more money than he let on. This guy is one of the wealthiest young people in the world, and according to this article, he's engaged to some senator's daughter back in New York. Marina felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Engaged? The article mentions an engagement announcement that was expected last spring, though I don't see any follow-up articles about an actual wedding. Marina hung up the phone and sat down on the nearest bench, her hands shaking. David Morrison, billionaire, possibly engaged to someone else. The sweet, humble tourist she had been falling for was actually one of the most powerful young men in America. But what hurt more than the money or the fame was the possibility that there was someone else in his life back home. Someone his family had chosen for him. Someone from his world. Marina pulled out her phone to call David, then put it away. She pulled it out again, then put it away again. What was she supposed to say? How do you have a conversation with someone when you've just discovered that everything you thought you knew about them was completely wrong? As the sun set over Prague, Marina sat on that bench and tried to figure out whether the man she had been falling for was real, or if David Morrison, the billionaire, had just been playing a very elaborate game with her heart. Marina barely slept that night. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation she had shared with David over the past week. Every moment felt different now that she knew who he really was. The humble backpacker asking for directions to Charles Bridge was actually a billionaire who could probably buy the entire bridge if he wanted to. But what hurt most wasn't the money or the fame. It was the possibility that she had just been some kind of vacation entertainment for him. A fun distraction from his real life before he went back to marry some senator's daughter and take over his family's empire. Monday morning came gray and drizzling, matching Marina's mood perfectly. She had called in sick to work, unable to face leading cheerful tourists around the city when her heart felt so heavy. Instead, she decided to walk to her favorite cafe to try to clear her head before David's flight left that afternoon. As she walked slowly through the quiet morning streets, Marina found herself looking for David's familiar figure around every corner. Part of her hoped to see him one more time, and part of her dreaded it. What would she even say to him? She was lost in these thoughts when she heard the soft purr of an expensive engine behind her. Marina glanced back and saw a long white limousine pulling up slowly beside her. Her first thought was that some wealthy tourist was lost and needed directions. Then the back door opened and David stepped out. But this wasn't the David she had spent the week with. Gone were the worn sneakers and faded backpack. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that probably cost more than Marina made in 6 months. His hair was styled differently, and he carried himself with a confidence and authority that she had never seen before. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was still the same man she had been falling for. The same gentle eyes, the same genuine smile, the same way of looking at her like she was the most important person in the world. "Hello, Marina," he said softly. And his voice was exactly the same voice that had asked her for directions just 1 week ago. Marina stood frozen on the sidewalk, unsure whether to run toward him or away from him. "David," she managed to say. "Actually," he said, stepping closer, "my full name is David Alexander Morrison, and I owe you the biggest apology of my life." Marina felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "David, I can't do this. I can't have this conversation standing next to a limousine in the middle of the street." "Then let's go somewhere we can talk properly," David said gently. "Please, give me 30 minutes to explain everything, and then if you never want to see me again, I'll respect that." Against her better judgment, Marina found herself nodding. David opened the limousine door for her, and she slid into the leather interior that was more luxurious than anywhere she had ever been. As they drove through Prague's morning traffic, David sat across from her, his hands folded in his lap, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. "Where do I even start?" he said finally. "How about with the truth?" Marina replied, trying to keep her voice steady. David took a deep breath. "The truth is that my name is David Morrison, and my family owns Morrison Industries. The truth is that I'm worth more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. The truth is that my father has been grooming me to take over the company since I was 18 years old." He paused, looking out the window at the city they had explored together. "But the other truth is that 3 months ago, I was the most miserable person you could imagine. I was suffocating under the weight of everyone else's expectations. My father had arranged for me to propose to Victoria, the daughter of a senator who could help our business interests. My entire life was planned out for me, and none of it felt like my choice." Marina felt a stab of pain hearing about Victoria, but she forced herself to listen. "So I did something I had never done before," David continued. "I told my father I needed time to think. I told him I was taking a month to travel and figure things out. And I made a decision to travel like a normal person, to see what life could be like if I wasn't David Morrison, heir to a fortune. And you chose Prague," Marina said quietly. "I chose Prague because it was beautiful and far away from everything I knew," David said. "But Marina, I never planned to meet someone like you. I never planned to feel the way I started feeling." The limousine had stopped in a quiet park, and through the windows, Marina could see the morning joggers and dog walkers going about their normal lives. "When you told me about your dream of opening a cultural center," David said, "I started making phone calls. Not because I was trying to impress you, but because your dream was beautiful and important and I wanted to help make it real." Marina's eyes widened. "What kind of phone calls?" David pulled out a folder from beside his seat and handed it to her. "I've been working with a foundation that supports cultural education projects. Marina, you could have your cultural center. Not someday, not if you can find investors. Now, the funding is approved. The legal paperwork is ready and all it needs is your signature." Marina stared at the documents in her hands, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "David, I can't accept this. This is charity." "It's not charity," David said firmly. "It's an investment in something worthwhile. Marina, I've seen a lot of business proposals in my life, and yours is one of the best ideas I've ever heard. This foundation funds projects that bring communities together, and your cultural center is exactly what they're looking for. Marina felt overwhelmed. But why? Why would you do this? David leaned forward, and for the first time since he had stepped out of the limousine, he looked like the vulnerable man she had fallen for. Because spending this week with you showed me what I want my life to look like. Not the life my father planned for me, not the life that makes the most business sense, but the life that makes me happy. What about Victoria? Marina asked, her voice barely a whisper. I called off the engagement arrangement 2 days ago, David said. I told my father that I wouldn't marry someone I didn't love and I wouldn't take over the company unless I could do it on my own terms. Marina looked up from the papers in her hands. And what did he say? He said I was making the biggest mistake of my life, David replied with a sad smile. He said I was throwing away everything the family had built for a girl I met on vacation. The words stung, even though Marina knew they came from David's father, not from David himself. But here's the thing, Marina, David continued, reaching across the space between them to take her hands. He's wrong. Meeting you didn't make me throw away my life. It made me find it. Marina felt tears running down her cheeks now. David, this is all too much. The money, the business, the foundation funding. I don't know how to be part of your world. You don't have to be part of my world, David said softly. I want to be part of yours. Marina, I meant what I said about everything feeling more real with you than it ever has in my life. Yes, I have money and business responsibilities. But that doesn't change the fact that I'd rather eat goulash in Pavel's tiny restaurant with you than attend fancy charity dinners with people who only care about what my family can do for them. Marina looked into David's eyes and saw the same sincerity that had drawn her to him from the beginning. So what happens now? She asked. Now you get to decide, David said. Can you forgive me for not being honest about who I was? Can you believe that my feelings for you are real, even though I lied about my background? And can you imagine a future with someone who comes with a very complicated life, but who loves you more than he ever thought possible? Marina was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the funding documents for her cultural center, then back up at David's hopeful face. I'm scared, she admitted. This is all so far beyond anything I ever imagined for my life. I'm scared too, David said. I've never cared about someone's answer to a question as much as I care about your answer right now. Marina thought about the past week, the way David had listened to her dreams, the genuine curiosity he had shown about her city and culture, the vulnerability in his voice when he talked about feeling trapped by other people's expectations. All of that had been real regardless of how much money he had in the bank. David, Marina said finally, if we're going to try this, you have to promise me something. Anything, he said immediately. Promise me that when you're with me, you'll be the David I met asking for directions to Charles Bridge. Not the billionaire, not the heir to Morrison Industries. Just David. That's the only David I want to be, he replied, and Marina could hear the relief in his voice. And promise me that we'll take this slowly. I need time to adjust to all of this. We'll take as much time as you need, David said. Marina, I would wait forever if it meant having a chance at a real future with you. Marina looked out the window at Prague, the city where she had lived her entire adult life, the city where she had just met someone who might change everything. Then she looked back at David, seeing both the humble traveler and the powerful businessman, and realizing that maybe she could love both sides of him. Okay, she said simply. Let's try. David's smile was brighter than anything Marina had ever seen, and when he kissed her softly in the back of that limousine, it felt like the beginning of an adventure that would be far more incredible than anything she had ever dared to dream.